It was a normal night for Greg. He worked as a driver at night, and although there were occasional odd jobs, he was used to the quiet and deserted streets of the city at night. The job had a predictable appeal: simple trips from point A to point B, infrequent conversations with passengers, and invariably monotonous routes. But this evening an unusual order awaited him. It was about 1:30 in the morning when Greg received a message about a new customer. His navigator led him to an expensive mansion on the outskirts of the city, in a quiet neighborhood where orders were rare. It was mostly rented out for private events or parties, but there wasn't a single lighted window in the mansion. The whole area was drowning in darkness, and it made him a little nervous. He glanced at the client's photo in the attachment. A man in his 40s, in a strict suit and with a frozen expression on his face, as if it were a photo for documents. The background of the photo showed a beautiful wood-paneled office. On the way, Greg had time to get a comment from the client. "Wait for me at the gate. No need to honk when you arrive. I'll get out myself." Greg parked by the dark metal fence that lined the lot and turned off his headlights so as not to disturb the silence of the night. He felt a little strange. Usually the customers would get out on their own or he'd signal them, but this was different. He glanced at the picture on his phone again, but didn't see anything suspicious. The client looked like a normal businessman, perhaps deciding to opt for privacy or just working late. About a minute later, barely noticing movement in the darkness, he heard the gate slam shut. The man in the photograph stepped out into the road. He moved slowly, keeping straight, and his face showed little emotion. When he got into the car, he nodded silently to Greg, signaling that he could start the trip. The man seemed even more aloof than in the photo, as if he'd long since forgotten what communication was. "Where are we going?" Greg asked, breaking the silence. "To an old motel on Highway 72. The man answered in a cold but quiet voice. Greg nodded and started the car. Highway 72 was just outside the city limits, and the motel on that road was a place no one had used in a long time. It had once been popular with truckers, but after the opening of the new highway it had been all but abandoned. Greg didn't ask too many questions. Everyone had their reasons, after all, and he'd learned over the years not to ask too many questions. On the way, the man sat motionless, occasionally looking away from the window as if checking the road, but said nothing. Greg noticed that his client's hands were shaking slightly, though he tried to keep them under control. At some point the silence became too tense, and Greg made a feeble attempt at conversation to distract himself. "The motel's old. Is there still someone working there? I thought it had been closed for about 10 years. The man looked at him through the mirror, and for a second something like doubt or fear flashed in his gaze. Then he spoke, almost in a whisper. "I have to be there to finish something." The words sounded strange and heavy, as if the client didn't fully understand why he was going there. Greg did not continue the conversation, sensing that the client was clearly uncomfortable with it. They drove through town and soon pulled onto a deserted highway that led to a motel. After a while, they reached a building standing alone in the middle of the empty road. The motel looked like it hadn't been renovated in the last few decades. There were no lights around, only an old motel sign hanging, "Askew," above the entrance. "Wait for me here," the customer finally said, and without waiting for a response, he got out of the car, closing the door behind him. Greg only nodded, watching as the man headed toward the building and disappeared into the darkness. He felt strange. Usually places like this made him feel uneasy, but on this night there was something particularly ominous about this abandoned place. He fiddled with his phone, glancing at the client's photo again, and suddenly his gaze lingered on his name. The name seemed familiar. Suddenly Greg remembered a news story he'd seen a couple weeks ago. It was about a missing businessman named Daniel Cross, a man from a respected family who had vanished without a trace. The last report mentioned that his last trace was spotted at a motel on Highway 72. The thought that the client could have been the very same missing man made Greg shudder. He tried to convince himself it was a coincidence, but a sense of unease grew stronger and stronger in his chest. Everything he'd seen in the photo, the same strict suit, the same withdrawn posture, the same tired look. How could it be? After all, if it was really him, then this man was missing, which meant he could no longer be trusted. Half an hour passed, and the man still hadn't left the motel. Greg felt there was no point in waiting any longer and decided to get out of the car to look around. The silence of the night around the motel was unnerving. He went to the door, but it was locked. He knocked, but no one answered. Greg returned to the car and, unable to resist, opened the app with the customer's photo again. Suddenly, his eyes fell on a caption under the photo that was previously unnoticeable. Passenger data updated. Last activity. 2 weeks ago. Greg felt his palms become wet. The next moment, he received a message from an unknown number. Thanks for the ride. My duty is complete. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it beating in his ears. He tried to dial the number, but only heard short beep. It looked as if the customer never existed. The next day, deciding to test his suspicions, he contacted the police and described the situation. The police station listened to him cautiously and advised him not to give any more rides to strangers at night, but they wouldn't give him any details about Daniel Cross. A few days later, Greg did see on the news that the missing businessman had been found at the motel. But as it turned out, he was found in an empty room, locked up, with no signs of external injuries. John was driving home on the night highway after a long day at the office. He had stayed late trying to finish a project, and this was his second sleepless night in a row. Even in the morning he thought he could manage, but now, with only darkness around him and hardly another car in sight, sleep began to pile up. The headlights of the cars ahead were blurring. The road seemed like an endless ribbon that led nowhere. It seemed to him that everything around him was vaguely repetitive, the same trees, the same markings, the same random signs on the side of the road. John lifted the window, letting in the night air to freshen up a bit, and turned on the radio, hoping the music would help cheer him up. But none of the waves were picking up music, just static and scraps of news. Finally, an announcement began on one of the channels. Attention drivers! There has been an accident on the I-90 highway. Please be careful and reduce speed when approaching the accident site. Emergency services are on the scene. John became alert. Even though the road in front of him was empty, he still slowed down and looked into the distance, expecting to see emergency lights. After about 10 minutes, flashing blue and red lights were indeed visible on the horizon. As he drove closer, John saw several road service vehicles and one completely wrecked car on the side of the road that a tow truck was slowly pulling out of the ditch. As he neared the scene of the accident, he caught a glimpse of a man lying motionless in the driver's seat of the wrecked car. His face was turned toward the window, and John froze for a moment. It seemed that the man in the wrecked car looked a lot like him. Same black jacket, similar facial features, same hairline. It was impossible to believe, but the stranger's gaze seemed to meet his, even though he remained perfectly still. John turned away in consternation and picked up speed. It's just fatigue, he reassured himself. I'm overworked, that's why I'm seeing things. He tried to convince himself that everything was normal, but the image of the man in the car kept coming back to him, as if he were looking at his own reflection. The road ahead was still empty, and it was still at least half an hour from home. The phone vibrated, and John flinched. He picked it up, hoping it was a friend or coworker, but to his surprise he saw his own name on the screen, as if the call was coming from his own number. It looked strange and frightening, but curiosity and some anxiety made him answer. Picking up the phone, he heard a familiar voice, his own voice, only frightened, hoarse and barely audible, as if someone was speaking from far away. You were in an accident. You didn't make it home. John dropped the phone, unable to believe his ears. His heart pounded with redoubled force, and he tried to find a rational explanation. This is someone's prank, he thought, though there was a strange feeling growing inside that this wasn't a joke. He glanced at his phone again, but there were no missed calls, no call record. It was as if nothing had happened. The surrounding darkness pressed down on him, and the road that had seemed familiar now looked unfamiliar. Unable to cope with his anxiety, he decided to stop at the nearest gas station to recover. After a few minutes, he spotted the light of a small gas station on the side of the road and turned toward it. It was quiet and empty, just a lone gas station attendant sitting behind the counter watching the news on a small TV. John walked up to the counter and tried to talk to the gas station attendant. "Excuse me, is everything quiet? There's an accident on the highway right now, I just drove by." The gas station attendant looked at him with a strange look, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Then he said slowly, "Listen, buddy, you've been here before. You came by here that night too, but you were in an accident." The gas station attendant's words came out of the blue. John tried to object, but was horrified to realize that he couldn't remember where he'd come from that evening or where he'd been before he'd seen the wrecked car on the highway. His mind was filled with vague images: the night, the road, the headlights, the impact, and the scraping of metal. It was as if he remembered something terrible for a moment, and then the memory faded back into darkness. He sprinted out into the street, looking around frantically. There were no keys in his car, nor his phone, which he realized had been left somewhere in the driveway. John walked slowly back to the gas station attendant, but he looked at him as if he saw a ghost in front of him. Louis sat in the car, staring at the phone screen where the order had popped up. There was no address in the request, just a directive to follow a route and the promise of a generous tip. Louis didn't usually take such orders, but it had been a quiet night, and cab work was his only income. He sighed, shook his head and, ignoring the bad feeling, pressed the accept button. As soon as the order was confirmed, the navigator's screen flickered and a voice spoke. "In 2 miles, turn right." Louis glanced at the route. A red line snaked across the map, taking him away from familiar neighborhoods and directing him somewhere out of town. He moved off, casting a brief glance at the empty street. The city slowly melted away in the rearview mirror, replaced by forest. The road grew narrower, the houses less and less frequent, and even the light from the street lamps disappeared. Fog drifted across the asphalt, giving the road an eerie tint. After a few miles, Louis realized that he was beginning to get a strange feeling, like he was heading into a trap. He tried to turn on the music, but the radio wasn't working, and his phone wasn't picking up a signal either. Overgrown trees appeared ahead, overhanging the road as if trying to hide it from view. "Soon you will arrive at your destination," came the voice of the navigator. Louis shivered involuntarily when he saw the road turn sharply to the left and go onto a country lane. After a few minutes, Louis reached the end of the road and stopped. There was silence all around, broken only by the noise of the engine. The navigator announced, "You have arrived." Louis looked around. An old, overgrown cemetery stretched out before him. He cursed to himself, thinking it was some kind of ridiculous joke, and looked at the map on his phone. But the same message appeared on the screen again. "Follow the route." Louis's hand shook involuntarily. Something was wrong. The headlights illuminated an old path leading deep into the cemetery. He got out of the car and walked slowly toward the first path, feeling the cold, damp air surrounding him. The cemetery was abandoned, with mangled headstones everywhere, half of them almost completely swallowed up by the earth. After a few minutes, Louis noticed that one of the graves looked unusually well maintained. He moved closer, shining his flashlight on it, and noticed the name clearly engraved on the headstone, Louis King. Louis felt his heart stop. It was his own last name and first name. It didn't make sense in his mind what it all meant. He took a step back, pondering what had happened, but then his gaze caught sight of a piece of paper lying next to the grave. He sat down and unfolded it. It was an old, faded newspaper. Louis quickly ran his eyes over the article and suddenly saw his photo. Underneath it was a note saying that he had gone missing a few days ago, after taking an overnight booking and disappearing, leaving his car at an unknown location. Lewis's hands began to tremble. He turned toward the car, but as he took a couple steps, he heard someone's voice behind him. "What's the hurry, Lewis?" said a quiet voice from somewhere out of the darkness. Lewis looked around, but there was no one around. Just silence and stillness. He rushed back to the car, but something was pulling him back, and his legs could barely move. Finally, when he reached the driver's door, he looked back and saw his grave. For a second he thought there was something moving from the ground, as if someone was trying to get out. Not wanting to stay here any longer, Lewis jumped into the car, started it, and turned around, driving out of the cemetery. But the faster he drove, the more he felt like he was circling the same route. The cemetery kept reappearing in his path, even as he drove farther and farther away. Finally, tired of the senseless movement, he stopped the car, got out and looked around. In front of him was the same tombstone again, his own name and the date, today's date.